live on YouTube, just connecting to Instagram. Yeah, I think we're live on both platforms. Let me check. Yes, great. So we have a fair number of people joining us, so maybe we can start the live. Um, Good evening to everyone who's tuned in. Today's discussion is about the important theme of structural transformation among scheduled caste in India, Jati level analysis. Allow me to introduce our speakers for the evening. Uh, Tamoghna Halder is an assistant professor at the School of Arts and Sciences, where he teaches economics. His research interest lies in the economic history of identities, as well as economics and politics of identity. He is currently teaching courses in microeconomic theory, economics of identity, statistics, and communicating economics. Very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. Uh,
And Akshit Arora is a research associate at the Center for Sustainable Employment, Azim Premji University. He is interested in the issues of employment and identity. Very warm welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So, to begin with, you mentioned in your EPW article that a significant heterogeneity exists across the scheduled caste jatis in terms of experiencing structural transformation. And yet, in multiple instances, the aggregate experience of SCs as a group as well is approximated by the median SC jatis. To what extent do such aggregations miss the actual variation in socio-economic experiences across castes?
First of all, thank you for organizing this live. It is really a great platform to speak to many more people in a different sort of a platform than just a written article. So, thank you for organizing this. One of the things that you may have noticed that we are throughout the article, whenever we talk about differences that we find in terms of the jati level experiences or jati level outcomes of scheduled caste jatis, we are using the term heterogeneity or variation or differences, and barely we use the specific word inequality. Now, this is essentially the key to sort of understanding what we are trying to say in the paper, and it directly relates to your question. So, the first thing is when we talk about aggregation of different jatis, that essentially means aggregating jatis at the level of constitutional categories. So, there are X number of jatis in a given constitutional category, and most of the data often is collected at the level of that particular constitutional category, whether it is SC, ST, OBC, etc. Now, what it does is essentially it wipes out a lot of possible variations that are happening at the jati level and not necessarily getting reflected at the level of the broader constitutional categories. So that was our primary motivation to come in into this particular set of work. And what we end up finding is the following, that yes, there is a significant variation, as one may predict. However, that variation is not necessarily always systematically explained, in the sense that you will often think that at the level of aggregations, we will think and we actually do find that SCs, STs, OBCs, and others, which is the broad umbrella term for anyone who is not SC, not OBC, not ST, we will typically find that whether you are looking at economic outcomes, whether you are looking at any other kinds of outcome that is captured in the data, we will find a certain hierarchy that one can explain with our intuition about how historically these different groups had privileges or did not have privileges, or how marginalized these groups were. So that is where we would expect a certain kind of explanation to these inequalities.
Mm-hmm.
However, when it comes to the scheduled castes and the jatis within them, there is a lot of conventional wisdom around us. Growing up, we hear that, or maybe even in newspapers, continuously we hear that this jati is very dominant even within the backward castes, or that jati has made so much progress. Oh, now look at that jati. They may have exceeded even the non SC jatis in some ways, right? So, these kind of conventional wisdom, essentially, what we are finding is does not necessarily work in that linear fashion, that you can immediately see that there is this kind of a variation which will immediately be explained by some sort of historical fact, or by exact you can pin down that this is how I am going to predict the inequality and see this is how my results are coming. That is not what is happening.
Right.
So this is where we make the point that when we are aggregating the jatis, we are seeing that it is actually overall the vulnerability of the most marginalized castes in India as a group gets well captured in the constitutional classification. And yet, at the same time, we are saying that yes, there is a certain kind of variation, and these variation are not one point factor that can explain. These are taking multiple forms, and some of those things we will discuss going forward. But these are taking multiple forms of explanation that can be there.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank you for laying down the bare facts for us and explaining that necessarily categorizing or boxing in one jati does not actually sum up their entire experiences. Um, and data itself can have its own limitations when we study these. Um, why or how does the socio-economic caste census become important for understanding the inequalities at the level of specific jatis?
Yeah. So, first of all, this is something that, as I just mentioned, that there's a lot of variation that we are already picking up, and at the same time, we are also finding some trade of uniformity. So this duality, in a sense, that yes, there is a variation across the jatis, but overall there are certain outcomes in which we are saying that there is a uniformity of experience in certain sectors that are happening, which are often being explained by certain factors which are very predictable. For example, Akshit will possibly in a while talk about the experience of SCs in construction sector. So in a way, because of this variation that we are picking up, remember we are using the population census data. Again, Akshit will talk about it most likely in a few minutes. But when we are using the population census data, one of the major limitation is that we are able to capture only the variation within the SC jatis, and we are not able to map them or reference them with how does the variation within, let's say, OBCs play out? How
Yeah.
does the variation within, let's say, general category plays out? So, in a way, the broader implication of using or collecting broader importance of collecting socioeconomic caste census information is to actually reference jatis across different kinds of categories, constitutional categories, and
Right.
that is essentially where we will get a proper reference point
Hmm.
for actually commenting on which jati had made progress to what extent.
Right.
This is essentially the importance. I will come back to some of the other aspect of socioeconomic caste census going forward if we get time.
Sure. We'll circle back to those points later. But coming to Akshay, what are some of the data sets and points of reference that you employed to arrive at your findings? And what are some of the methodological challenges you faced in locating some of these answers? I think there's a technical issue. Let me just add Akshay.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, can you repeat the question? I just missed it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What are some of the data sets and points of reference you employed to arrive at your findings, and what are the methodological challenges you faced in locating some of these answers?
Yeah, so as Tamoghna mentioned, for all of this exercise, we're using the population census data. So
Right.
for individual belonging to the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe categories, the Census of India collect information on their jati identity as well. Like, so we get to know within scheduled caste broad group what jati specifically they belong to. For each of these jati in scheduled caste and scheduled tribe group, there's an information on their education and employment outcome, which is available at the state level. So one thing that need to be noted down here is the census data is the data which is available aggregated at the state level. No, it's not a unit level data. However, multiple censuses have collected information related to education and employment outcomes, and this goes back till as far as 1951 census. But the way that output or the data has are available is not very user friendly. So we go with the three so the census round in which the data is much more user friendly is 91, 2001, and 2011 census years. Even for these three census reports, the format of jati level information vary quite a bit. So, for example, data on the industrial category that we have used for this piece, there were only four broad industrial categories in 2001, as compared to nine or more categories in 1991 and 2011. So, to make a comparison more granular and to get a much better sense of the movement of people within these industrial categories, we are restricting our analysis for two time points, 91 and 2011, and we have used the 1991 and 2011 census data. Secondly, for whole of our analysis, we are taking only those jatis which were present in both the 1991 and 2011 census round, because you cannot comment on how the jati has performed if you don't have a numbers for a jati for a 1 year. And third, to compare jatis over time, first we match the jatis within the state. So this implies that matching and harmonizing spelling variation within a state. So for instance, in Andhra Pradesh, the jati Adi Dravida, the spelling of this jati has changed between 91 and 2011. And
Right.
similarly, there were some jatis which were clubbed into one single jati within these two time periods. So essentially, the task was to make the jatis harmonize over the census rounds. And finally, our analysis, there were 177 jatis for 12 major Indian states. Now coming back to the industrial categories, in 1991 there were 10 broad industrial categories for the workers, and whereas for in 2011 these categories were there were 19 categories in 2011, and they were much more better in terms of categorization and mapping of the industrial outcomes. But as we have to compare the how the transformation has taken place between 91 and 2011, we restricted ourselves to the six broad industrial categories, which are agriculture laborer, cultivators, construction, non-household manufacturing, services. Yes. And for each state, we compute the distribution of worker across these six categories for each of the SC jatis and for scheduled caste as a group. And in order to understand how the scheduled caste as a group broadly differs, we had a other group which is basically non-SC/ST. So this basically means all population minus SC/ST population in a state, while the estimate for others serve as a benchmark exercise, but one needs to be cautious about it because uh, in the others, like as Tamoghna mentioned, right, this is because census does not allow us a detailed breakup of a non-SC/ST categories, and one should not compare these figures with SC jatis since the former aggregate over the differences that exist between non-ST/ST category. So, instance, in non-ST/ST category, we have Brahmins as well as OBCs, which are very different group. So it's just a category which act as a benchmark to compare how the scheduled caste as a group has done in terms of transformation.
Right.
Other than that, in the analysis for a given industrial category, we use the term median jati in our piece, which Tamoghna mentioned, which
Yes.
indicate the jati that lies at the median of the distribution of worker from all jatis. Suppose they were, like for example, in 1991, 63.4% of workers in Jati Palan in Tamil Nadu worked as agricultural laborer, and that Jati was a median Jati in 1991 for the Jatis working in the schedule, Jatis working in agriculture, working as agricultural labor, and in 2011, this the median jati was Adi Dravida, and it compromises of 42% of 42 approximately 42% of the people in this jati were in agricultural labor. Thus, therefore, when we describe the shift in the median jati, we are not necessarily talking about the same jati in both years. And in fact, these jatis are not necessarily the same, indicates that structural transformation need not be rank preserving for a jati.
Okay.
And in terms of like some challenges, what we had to face is, so there were multiple small jatis in a state. So and the problem is, so suppose a jati which comprise of 0.2% of scheduled caste population, and all of them are working in a construction sector, or all of them are working in the service sector. So in that way, if we are including all those jatis, which has very insignificant share in the state scheduled caste population, they can change the distribution of the jatis in a particular industry significantly. So we are only taking those jatis which at least has a share of 0.5% in overall scheduled caste population in that state. And for all of this exercise, we are not making any all India claims about the jati. Like we are not saying that okay, we are clubbing the jati chamars and like we are comparing the jati chamars in all the state, because like the trajectory of a jati in a state could be very different. Like for instance, the Mahars in Maharashtra could be very different from the Mahars in Karnataka, depending on the historical and political factors.
Right.
And lastly, in terms of the challenging, it's worth to note that in terms of structural transformation, most of the discussion that we are going to make is related to the Kuznets process, which essentially means is that how is there is a how the movement out of agriculture work is like played out for jatis, and we are not talking about the Lewis process, which is how there is a movement out of the subsistence production. The latter definition is usually always difficult to capture with the given data sets, and also more difficult because we have very limited jati level data, and so it's very difficult. So most of the people are talk about the Kuznets process in contrast to the Lewis process. So this is one limitation, or one, like, yeah, one of the things we have not talked about.
Right. Thank you for elaborating your methodology in such detail. And from what you've said, one can infer that really such studies call for a much more context based analysis so as to not fall into the trap of generalizations.
Exactly.
Right. So, coming to Professor Halder, you trace the correlation between occupational trajectories and caste based outcomes. How does the occupational trajectory of scheduled caste in Rajasthan differ from those in neighboring states like Gujarat or Punjab? How do regional social cultural norms tie into the continuation of caste hierarchies?
Yeah. So, just sort of clarify this particular bit, there are two sort of interesting things that are happening when it comes to Rajasthan, and it all essentially started with one sort of striking finding, which those who have joined the live, they will be able to see the paper where one of the graphs we actually put out, we show that movement out of agriculture
Yes.
in terms of different SC jatis. What we would typically expect is that when a jati is moving out of agriculture, an SC jati is moving out of agriculture, we would expect that to happen out of agricultural labor and not necessarily from the cultivator, which has a connotation of cultivating your own land. Now, Rajasthan becomes a quite interesting case where we see that most of the a chunk of the movement, unlike in any other state, uh, a chunk of the movement is happening in terms of moving out of cultivation as opposed to moving out of agriculture. So this is one of the interesting thing about Rajasthan. Now, if you go back, sort of to the larger history of caste in Rajasthan and marginalization of different castes in Rajasthan, uh, we are not we did not make and we are still not making any larger claim because we think that this is outside our scope. But at the same time, one can pick up certain accounts both from academics, anthropologists, historians that, for example, take the case of the Jati Meghwal, which has been, once again, uh, we are being very cautious here in terms of what we can claim, and we are drawing upon multiple authors.
Yes.
So some of the authors would suggest, some of the historians would suggest that historically Megwals has been one of the relatively dominant within the backward castes. So these kind of trajectories, and there is also a long history of each of the jatis that have formed socially, historically, politically, how they have evolved, how they have interacted with political power, how they have interacted with different axes of marginalization. Sometimes marginalization came from the vantage point of direct physical brutality. Sometimes it comes from not having any kind of land. So again, these histories differ so much from literally district to district. And here we are seeing that one of these interesting difference that we are picking up here is across these three bordering states, Rajasthan, Punjab, and Gujarat. And
Yes.
we are seeing that in Rajasthan particularly, possibly because of a very different kind of a land relation, historically STs are moving out much more from cultivation as opposed to agricultural labor. So once again, if we get time, I will highlight some more interesting cases that we find out from other states where it goes against our conventional wisdom of how movements are happening.
Right. Okay. Um, how does the movement, like you mentioned, out of agricultural work compare to the movement into non-agricultural work among the scheduled castes in India? Akshit.
Yeah. So first, as we all know, like there is an unequal distribution in land ownership in India. So movement out of agriculture work implies very different trajectory across caste group, as Tamoghna mentioned now. So at the broad constitutional categories, this would imply movement of cultivation for non-ST/ST groups, while for SCs, scheduled caste, it would mostly be a movement out of agricultural laborer kind of a work. And in all the states, the percentage change in agriculture laborer at the median of the distribution is the same as that of the scheduled caste on average. So, which implies for most of the states, the experience of scheduled caste as a group is closely approximated by the jati that lies in the median of the distribution. And as shown in the paper, not all jatis within scheduled caste have been able to move out of agricultural labor at an
Yes.
equal rate across state. So some states have higher rate of transition, for example, Kerala, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Gujarat. And further, even within these states, there is a variation across jatis. So, for instance, in both Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, the fall in share of median jati working as agriculture laborer is quite similar, but the distribution of jatis in these two states is quite different. For Tamil Nadu, the spread is much less for jatis than for the jatis in Karnataka. And then one obvious argument for the observation I made is that even the scheduled caste may experience an equally disadvantaged social standing across state or region. The experience of jatis both within and within state is quite heterogeneous.
Yeah.
And in terms of the movement into non-agriculture work, I think we made three key points in our paper. First, the rate of movement into non-household manufacturing is slow for everyone, whether for the median jati within the scheduled caste or for the larger groups such as scheduled caste and non-SC/ST group. Basically, it talks about how the manufacturing sector in India has stagnated and how it has failed in terms of employing people in India.
Yes.
Second, as one may expect, the construction sector, the most physical labor intensive category, draws a significant higher share of scheduled caste and from all the jatis within the scheduled caste. While the non-SC/ST hardly see any increase, like hardly any significant movement into construction for the non-SC/STs.
Okay.
And finally, there is significant movement into services for both scheduled caste and non-SC/ST group. However, unlike the case of construction, the experience of scheduled caste as a group does not translate to all the scheduled caste jatis. That is, while the median jati may experience an upward movement, the distribution as a whole does not necessarily shift upward. And additionally, like in case of movement of agriculture, there exists a significant jati level heterogeneity corresponding to all the observations like that I just made. And the rise in, like the other point I want to make here is the rise in the employment of all jati in construction is in sharp contrast to our observation in case of movement out of agriculture. So what we saw was there were certain jatis which are like the movement for whom the movement was not very significant from agriculture. But in case of construction, I think mostly all the jatis has witnessed a significant increase. So in the case of construction, the movement of median jati aligns well with the movement of each jati. So
Okay.
it implies there's a the distribution as a whole shift upwards, or like there's a for each jati there's a significant increase in the employment in the construction sector. Now, as we are pointing out, because we are working with census, and there's some like caveat in working with it, like in terms of movement in the service sector, the service sector includes a wide range of work within it, and in the and we cannot like make a point whether that they are moving to a modern services like IT, education, or health, or whether they are still working in caste-based services which were associated to them. Like so, for instance, one of the case we were looking at the occupations in which the jatis are still working, and the jatis like mochi were significantly overrepresented in the leather works kind of thing, and significantly there was other jatis which have been historically associated with some caste based work, and that is still there. So in terms of that, we cannot make a much, like we cannot make a claim whether movement to services is a good thing or not because of the constraint of the data.
Right. Right. Very well said. Do you also think these trends vary across men and women?
Yeah, so one of the section in our paper talks about how like these trends or the movement or the structural transformation experience have been different for men and women, and there's been a lot of literature talking about how there has been segregation in terms of men working in certain kind of employment and women working in certain kind of employment, and in terms of movement out of agriculture, both men and women had a similar experience, like both with regard to change in the median as well as the heterogeneity. Like both men and women had, for scheduled caste jatis, there was a movement out of the agriculture work. But the thing that to be pointed out here is the scale of movement is much higher for women. So one possible explanation that we could think about is the base effect. So the proportion of women working as agriculture laborer in 1991 was much higher than male in all states. So like it seems little intuitive that they would be moving mostly out of the agriculture, like the change would be much higher. But then again, there are some state level variation. For instance, in Andhra Pradesh, almost approximately 88% of women were employed as agriculture labor in 1991, and just there was just a change of 8% between 1991 and 2011. Whereas for women, the base, like the proportion of men working in working as agricultural labor in 1991 was much less, but they still saw a similar 8% fall in the share. And when we compare the case of Andhra Pradesh with the Kerala, we see that there's a 35% reduction in the share of women which are working in agriculture labor. And for the men, the numbers are 25%. So in terms of movement out of industry, there was some state level variation, of course, and yeah, and the fall for mostly the fall was much higher for the female. Yes, and in terms of the movement into industries, we observe a same trend as as I talked about in the previous question, like men moving to the construction sector, and for women, this movement is mostly been into the service sector. And the thing is, like I already talked about, right? The service sector is so broad that we cannot comment like whether it's the modern services or the traditional services in which the women are entering into.
Right, and
And
we can't see it as a transformative sort
yeah,
of.
we cannot like yeah say it with like we cannot claim it as a like an improvement in the employment condition or not.
Right.
And states which has a larger share of states which have a larger fall in the share of agriculture sector are also the states which witnessed a much increase in the construction or service sector. So the states which has more change between 1991 and 2011 in the movement out of agriculture were also the states where the men and women are entering more into construction or services sector.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Um, Tamoghna, you detail the intersection of political power, social assertion, and socio-economic outcomes within the context of caste. In the case of the Mahars of Maharashtra, for instance, or even how politics influences the trajectories of the Chamars or the Dusads hailing from Bihar. Could you elaborate on this? Um, and also, you also mentioned the Sundris of West Bengal and how they defy the conventional ideas of identity and political prominence.
Yeah. So again, sort of to quickly summarize what we have been saying so far and what we have
Yes.
mentioned in the uh, paper itself, there are largely 2 points that we are making. The first point is that there is a variation that we are picking up. For example, these variations can be at jati level, this variation can be at state level. So it's in a way not a very linear kind of a prediction that one can do. Okay, all SC jatis across India will be moving out of agricultural labor in every state. As we saw, Rajasthan becomes an exception. Or for that matter, we cannot make a comment that everyone will be moving into one particular kind of industrial categorization across states. But on the other hand, what we see is there are certain trades that connect all of it. For example, one would expect that more and more in the context of structural transformation, but not necessarily in the sense of economic improvement, one can think of a large portion of marginalized jatis going into construction work, which is tied to physical labor, which again
Yes.
ties back to historical trajectories of marginalization. So
Yes.
these kind of trades exist. Now, this is exactly where we bring in these contextual counter examples to conventional wisdom. So, for example, a lot of in fact, there are multiple works, including some of Anant Teltumbre's, which would suggest that there are how different classes are getting formed uh, within the marginalized themselves, and often the axis in which anti-caste movements have worked, it has often given sort of, let's say, a political prominence that gets associated with certain jatis. Now, our question is that, again, our conventional wisdom says that just because we hear about Mahars in Maharashtra, our tendency is to associate that with a sharp economic outcome, and often the arguments in popular conversations go to the extent that, okay, do they even need reservation anymore? Now, this is exactly where we want to hit, in the sense that it is not necessary that just because a jati is at the forefront of a political movement or a social assertion or any kind of larger prominence or visibility, that does not necessarily always map one on one to better economic outcomes. This is neither to say that political prominence in itself does not matter. This is not to say that visibility does not matter, but this is actually to hit back against the conventional wisdom that just because a group is at the forefront of an anti caste movement, or in general in terms of the larger society, politics, etc., does not necessarily imply that they will automatically be at the forefront of the economic as well. And
Right.
one of the reasons is that we do not pick up any representation, also whatever is the percentage of Mahars in the state population or the share within the SC population, we do not see a over-representation as such in when we go into fine-tuned classification of occupations, such as let's say corporate work, these that. So the relatively better income or associated with better income, what would be the occupation if we trace those, we do not really see a overrepresentation, or even for that matter, a perfect relative representation for certain jatis. Now, contrast this with the case of, for example, uh, in Bihar. One of the interesting cases that we find is that for a long set of reasons, which are again historical and political, the Dusads or the Paswans have not been part of the Mahadalit categorization for a long, long time. In fact, there was, if I'm not wrong, if I recall correctly, there was a long time where since the Mahadalit formation, one by one, different Dalit groups became part of the Mahadalit configuration. The Dusas were the only one to stay out of it. And what we pick up between 1991 and 2011 is that actually the Dusas were relatively doing better. By the way, when I'm saying better, I'm saying just with respect to other SC jatis, not with respect to jatis that are not SCs. So
Yeah.
within the SC jatis, we do see that the Dusads have economically at least experienced a little better outcome than the others. So again, that Mahadalit categorization that happened, it to us it actually made sense in some ways. Now, of course, there can be debate around how what exactly should be the threshold of economic performance at which you do this kind of subcategorization. Those are separate debates, and our paper does not go into that. And finally, the interesting case of Suris that you mentioned is, this is another interesting case study that we point out that in West Bengal again, generally Namashudras and the Rajbanshis have been at the forefront of the anti-caste discourse in general, and that is what most of the caste in Bengal kind of discussion has been largely restricted to Namashudras and Rajbanshis, historically, research-wise, so on and so forth. But at the same time, if you look at the data, what is happening is you are neither picking up Rajbanshis or Namashudras to be at the forefront of economically better outcomes. Instead, we are picking up Shuris who are essentially in it's just in West Bengal. Actually, they are listed as scheduled caste. In some other states, I think in Bihar and Orissa, most likely they are part of OBCs, and there are other states where they might be present but not part of any reserved category. So, in a way, you can see this contrast that there exists a jati which has not been discussed in detail in terms of their political history or social history as such, which, let's say, in a popular term, if I am to put it, do not come to news as much. And at the same time, you see that there is a very different kind of economic trajectory that they are experiencing. And this is also a jati which happens to be not under reservation in many states, and definitely not under SC reservation in most of the states. So
Right.
here again, it's sort of a interesting illustration of the empowering nature of reservation that one can associate with a given jati, which is not reserved in a similar manner in other states, how the trajectories might become different. So these are the different illustrations that we point out just to encourage more and more research using these data sets. And of course, yeah, if we get time, I'll circle back to the question of socioeconomic caste census.
And I think research such as yours can help sort of break certain perceptions that people hold at a societal level and warn us against using simplifications when it comes to such analysis. Um, what are some of the broad implications of your analysis? Is there scope for further research in this arena to broaden our understanding of the complex interlinkages between caste, power, and traditional occupations?
Yeah, so I'll go first about it. So, in terms of major implication, as I pointed out, how the overall experience of a group need not necessarily like translate to the categories or jatis. Secondly, how for the men and women, although there was a movement out of agriculture, but the movement into non-agriculture, how it was essentially different. But the main thing I think, which we didn't talk and didn't get much time to talk about, is what are the factors which could possibly explain the differences in the structural transformation experience of jatis?
Yeah.
So, one of the factor which could essentially result in the change in the employment opportunities is the education. How well, how good the jatis have done in terms of attaining literacy or basic education. So when we try to look at the effect of education, oh, we are not making any causal claim here, first of all,
Okay.
but when we try to look for the effect of education on the movement out of agriculture work in a broad way, we didn't get much correlation between the two for the northern states specifically. For the southern state, there was some relation, like the jatis which were able to get more educated or which saw a higher increase in the literacy. There was some movement out of the agriculture labor, but for the northern states, there was not any, like we can't find any relation out between these two uh, things. And the other factors like how the land holdings could have affect the jati level experiences and all. The problem again comes is we don't have the access to data to test some of these hypotheses. Like like how can we explain these differences in the jati experiences? And I think Tamoghna could add further about what.
Sure.
So, this actually perfectly sets me up also to talk about both the sort of extension of this particular work that we are looking at right now, and at the same time, what is the implication for socioeconomic caste census, so on and so forth. So, the first thing in terms of one of the extension of this kind of a work is that right now we are looking at going back till 1961. We are looking at how these different jatis have changed over time, and in terms of both, on one hand, their educational trajectory at a level of a group, and on the other hand, in terms of their occupational category as at the level of a group, and whether there is any correlation between the two in a relatively longer run, in the sense of 1961 till 2011. Now, we are standing in 2024, and it is of course obvious to us like 2011 seems so far back already.
Yeah.
So this is precisely where the point about socioeconomic caste census comes in. Now I'll say two sort of important points here. One is whether you call it a caste survey or call it a caste census, in terms of the Bihar socioeconomic caste census results that have come out, that has clearly shown us that we are far away from understanding how actually economic outcomes continue to be in a much more rigid association with caste in general. So, for example, one of the things that the SSC in Bihar clearly shows that There has been so much talk in general in the popular political discussions, etc., that there is a certain dominance of Yadavs in Bihar politics. There is a certain influence of Yadavs in the larger politics of Bihar, and to some extent, that automatically overflows or spills over to the direction that, therefore, they are also at the forefront of the economic. And the Bihar socioeconomic census or survey, as you want to call it, does not really capture that. It does show that Yadavs are performing well within the OBCs, but they are not necessarily performing in aggregate as good as, let's say, some of the other groups like caste.
Right.
So, in a way, this is where a lot of the internal comparisons would come out, uh, which would give us up to date data to really talk about how historical institutions continue to persist.
Yes.
Uh, but at the same time, here is the caveat of this, that I do think that the way the socioeconomic caste census of 2011 was carried out in general, that particular census, the module of the questions that were there, they do not really significantly differ from some of the existing questions that are asked in the population census itself. Now, here is a misconception that population census never captures Jati level data. And the evidence of that is right here, this particular paper itself. We
Yes.
use Jati level data from population census. The thing is that it does not capture Jati, it captures Jati level data only for the SC Jatis or the ST Jatis. It does not capture it for the other Jatis.
Right.
So, whenever the next population census is going to happen, if socioeconomic caste census really becomes a very politically sensitive issue, this, that, then I guess one of the easy way to understand things would be just to extend the existing framework of population census in order to just ask one extra question. All the other questions are same. It's just about asking one more extra question to non-SCs and non-STs about capturing the jati. And in fact, the population census does a quite good job in terms of cleaning the jati level data when they publish it. So
Yeah.
the jatis actually, SC jatis actually map onto the state list of SCs very well. There is not much difference that is happening. It's not that they're inventing a lot of different kinds of jatis. So just that there are multiple challenges, I understand, of collecting data at Jati level. But at the same time, I think population census in its current framework can also be updated if one wants to avoid all the confusion and political discussion sensitivity that gets formed around the question of socioeconomic caste census. And this is precisely where we actually can get in-depth information on, for example, one of the things that we haven't discussed, we didn't get the chance to, is how dhobis, for example, across states, we have often seen that they are performing very well in terms of educational outcome as a group. We see a lot of graduates.
Yes.
The graduate share is at times very high, coming as compared to other SC jatis for dhobis, but they continue to be represented in occupations that are still related to laundry.
Right.
So, how are these mismatches happening? That is where new theory would come out, in fact, to question what is even the efficacy of our education system in itself. Some of the things that other scholars like Kalayarasan already points out, that education in itself had an elite bias in India,
Right.
which reconfigured the way, even in a newer economic system, caste will continue to persist despite a certain kind of educational progress being made by the marginalized groups. Certain economic opportunities are framed already through the existence of caste, and therefore caste will just reinvent itself, and certain groups will just continue to be stuck in the traditional occupations or at the periphery of those occupations. So that is where SCCC can really help, or even a modified population census can also help.
Yes. Thank you. That neatly sums up our discussion for the day. Thank you to both our speakers, Tamoghna as well as Akshit, to contribute so richly to such an under-discussed theme. And I hope we can keep having conversations like these and build further research on this. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to read this article, it's very much available on our website. And I'd also like to take out a moment to request you to sort of subscribe to us and follow us on our social media channels. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening.
Have a good evening.